I saw an online ad for some free stuff, and one of them was this giant Weedeater blower. This has to be one of the largest and heaviest handheld blowers I've ever worked on, and I really thought about not picking it up. The reason is I have a hard time getting rid of these things. Once people see them, and then when they finally pick them up, they realize these are not easy to handle. So today's project is this Weedeater brand blower, and the problem is the pull rope. It has a hard time retracting and is quite difficult to use, and because I can't use the pull rope, I don't know if it even works. Just for a size comparison, here is my snap-on impact, and as you can see, it makes it look small. When comparing them by weight, the impact is roughly 5 pounds, while the blower is a hefty 13 pounds. That may not sound like a lot, but most handheld blowers weigh in at about 8 to 10 pounds, so in my book, that makes this one very difficult to use. Now, I'm going to try and repair this blower, however, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. After looking in the fuel tank, it sounds like there's still some in there, which could mean that this thing was working when the pull rope started having issues. However, by the cobwebs, I think the last time it was used may have been some time ago, so the fuel may not be good anymore. As you can see, I can pull on the rope, but it doesn't want to return all the way in, so I can't get a good pull to try and start the engine. The one time it did retract, the handle hit the blower and the handle broke. Not to sound cheap, but I don't intend on replacing it. Instead, I have a plan to try and fix it. After pouring out the fuel, it's very obvious that it is bad because it doesn't smell like gasoline from the station. The other way is the color. It's much too dark, which is a sign of oxidation, which happens over a long period of time. Now the recoil assembly is mounted to the engine and is sandwiched between the blower housing. That means we'll have to take off the blower section first, followed by the impeller, and then we'll be able to see the recoil. Now there are a lot of bolts, so I would recommend using a power tool to help remove all the fasteners. They're all the same, so you don't have to worry about keeping them in order. After all the fasteners have been taken out, along with the lower housing, we can see the impeller and the shredder. We just need to remove the nut, followed by the shredder and the plastic impeller. There's also a metal tube we need to remove as well. After that, we'll remove the 4 screws on the top housing, then we'll be able to see the rope and the recoil assembly. After separating the upper housing from the engine, there's a bar that guides the rope that we need to remove, and after that we need to slide the eyelet for the rope out of its anchor. Before we can remove the recoil, we need to remove 4 long bolts and 1 short one that holds it to the engine. Now this is the only point where you'll find different sized bolts, but it's not difficult to remember where each one of them goes. Now once these are off the engine, we should be able to remove the recoil assembly. Now even off the engine, you can see that it's still having difficulties. That can only mean that the issue is the spring that's inside it. Now to get to it, we need to remove the 2 retainers and then remove the pulley that holds the rope. After taking out the pulley, I can see there's a lot of rust staining on the plastic, which is not a good sign. More than likely, the issue is rust, and unfortunately, it means a lot of work to remove it. Now just be very careful when removing the cup holding the spring, because it's very dangerous. So it's not terrible, believe it or not. I've seen worse. It looks like there's a lot of surface rust on the spring. Now the rust staining even made its way to the recoil housing, which now needs to be cleaned. For the next few minutes, I'm going to try and remove the rust from all the plastics. Now this may not seem important, but I need to get as much off as possible and then lubricate it. So using soap didn't work very well on the white plastic part, so for the recoil housing, I'm going to use the old fuel that came out of the fuel tank. Now this plastic is also a different type than the white one, and the rust isn't sticking to it in the same way. Before I take the spring out of the cup, I'm going to try and remove the rust on this side of the spring. Now this is not the final cleaning. We still need to take the spring out of the cup and remove the rust from the flat surfaces. This is going to be the hard part, and it's also going to take the most time. If I had one suggestion for cleaning this part, it would probably be to wear some gloves. It doesn't matter what kind because it's quite dirty. When taking the spring out of the cup, be very careful and also wear some safety glasses because it's very dangerous. Now, after letting it carefully unwind, I'm then going to use some sandpaper on the entire length of the spring. Once I've scuffed as much as I can, I might have to do it more than twice just to be sure I got the majority of the rust off the spring. After that, I'm going to use some brake cleaner to remove all the residue left by the cleaning. You're going to have to do this multiple times as well. Now, after each pass, the color of the residue will be lighter and there will be less of it on the towel. Once I'm satisfied that it's as clean as I can get it, I'm going to rewind the spring by hand. Now, this used to be really difficult for me, but after doing it several times, it's become a lot easier. Once it gets small enough, I'll then put the spring back into the cup. If you want to avoid the hassle of cleaning the spring, I would just order a brand new one. Now, the springs aren't as cheap as they used to be. A single spring could cost you several dollars, and you still have to install it into the cup, which is still quite dangerous. After getting the spring into the cup, I'm going to spray it with lubricant, and I might be going a little overboard on it, and this is to make up for any bits of rust I might have missed. The other thing that I noticed is that the rope is really short, so I'm going to remove the old one and replace it. Now, I don't have any nylon rope this size, so I'm going to use some other rope that I have lying around. Like I said, more than likely, I'm not going to be able to get rid of this blower anytime soon, so it'll be with me for some time. If I get some rope this size in that time, I'll replace it again. Now, after getting the rope off the pulley, I'm going to try and fix the handle. The plan I have is to melt the two pieces back together. If I do it well enough, most people won't be able to notice it. If not, I'll replace the handle with one from a different piece of equipment. Now, I don't see this as being cheap, but resourceful. Besides, if you had money, you wouldn't be doing this repair in the first place. You'd go to your local big box store, or if you really knew your stuff, you'd go to a lawn equipment distributor and buy a high quality blower instead. So after several minutes, it's finally back together in one piece, and it doesn't look too bad. I'll decide later on if I want to sand the plastic smooth, but for right now, I'll keep it this way. After that's done, I'm going to install the handle to the new rope, and then install the other end of the rope to the pulley. Now, most people would say that I'm wasting my time trying to fix this old piece of equipment, and I can definitely see their point of view. However, if I can save this blower, it means I don't have to buy a new one, which, depending upon which brand I buy, may not be a quality machine. This, however, was made a couple of decades ago when they wanted machines to last at least more than 2 seasons. Now, this rope isn't designed for small engines, but I've used it in the past and haven't had any issues with it. I just have to make sure there's plenty of line so it's harder to get to the end of the rope. Now, I don't change lines very often, and that's why I typically don't have this line size available. Before I install the recoil spring and pulley, I'm going to spray a lot of lubricant anywhere there might be friction. I know there's going to be viewers out there who would tell me it's not needed, and I would only agree with them if the parts I was putting back in the housing were brand new, but since the parts I'm putting back in are old and worn, I'm going to put some lube down first. Now, I'm using lithium grease, but you can use whatever you have lying around. Something like WD-40 or Marvel Mystery Oil will work too. I just would not use motor oil. I will tell you that I've used this blower several times since putting this blower back together, and the new rope and recoil work extremely well. The next part is very difficult to film, and it's winding up the spring. You want to get the rope in this notch on the pulley because it'll help you turn the pulley. There's not a lot of room for my hands and the camera, so I tried editing it so you can see the rope pass by. I tried turning it about 4 times and then letting the rope wind itself back onto the pulley. Unfortunately, after letting it wind itself on the pulley, I realized I still had about 1.5 feet of rope left off the pulley. That means I have to put a few more turns on the spring and try again. I had to do this twice because I didn't want to put too many turns on the spring, otherwise it could bind up when you pull on the rope. Once I was satisfied with how many turns I put on the spring, I then replaced both the retainers on the housing. The retainers could also hinder the pulley from working like it should, so I also sprayed the edge of the pulley with more lithium grease. That reminds me, I need to buy another can of this stuff. Now, once I'm done, I did a couple of test pulls, and it seems to be working very well. Before I install it, I want to spray some lubricant on the posts for the starter pawls. Now, these look fine, but I want to make sure they stay that way too. After that, I'll then install the recoil assembly along with all the bolts. Once I get all the bolts tight, I'm going to pull on the rope a few times and make sure it turns the engine over without any issues. After that, I can then start putting this thing back together. To be honest, this isn't as bad as some of the other blowers I've worked on before on this channel. The design is a bit strange to me, but overall it's nothing but several screws, a housing, and a large impeller to remove to get to the recoil. The only real changes from this model to the current ones is that the impeller has rotated 90 degrees and the recoil is no longer sandwiched between the impeller and the engine. It's now on the other side of the engine, which makes it a lot easier to work on or replace. The only real issue is the weight of this thing and getting parts for it. I've worked on blowers that were only 5 years old, and when I needed parts, I couldn't find OEM parts, and instead, I had to settle for aftermarket parts. It's not a big deal, but what happens when you have a blower that's 25 years old? How hard is it to find parts for something that old? When you get to that point, you pretty much have to buy a parts blower just to keep yours going. Someone asked me why I retired my Kawasaki blower, and I told them it was because it was hard to find parts for it. The blower still works fine, but eventually if I have to replace something critical like the carb or a coil, I'm going to have trouble finding the parts, and if I do find the parts, they'll be very expensive. So I just stripped one of the screw holes in the blower housing. Now it's not the end of the world because I think it'll still hold until I can fix it later on. If I still have this blower, I'll show you how I plan on fixing this issue. Now once the blower is back together, I'm going to prime the carb with some fuel because there's no purge bulb and see if we can get it started. So unfortunately it didn't start, but before I try anything else, I'm going to look at the spark plug and see if there's an issue there. And it looks like there's water in the engine because fuel doesn't have this sort of surface tension to bridge between the electrode and the ground. I'm going to turn the engine over a few times to try and dry it out. Next, I'll reinstall the spark plug and also an inline spark checker to confirm that we have a working ignition system. When doing this test, try and find a very shady place to perform it. So there was an orange glow in the tester, which shows we do have spark from the ignition system. Next, I'm going to remove the spark plug and install a compression tester to see if the engine is just too worn out to even run. It's unfortunate because since the rope wasn't working, I couldn't test for these issues before fixing it. So the reading is only 75 psi, which is not terrible, but it's not great either. The compression tester measures how much pressure your engine could make on the compression stroke, and the higher the better. This reading does show that the engine is tired, but it has enough compression to still run though. If you'd like to get a compression tester and learn more about them, there's a link in the description. I think the engine might be drying out, so next I'm going to prime the carb and try starting it. This time we finally get to hear this thing run and it sounds really good. Just on a hunch, I'm going to look at the fuel line and filter and see if they need replacing. And to my surprise, it looks like they were changed out at some point. That means they might have also inspected the carb as well. I'm going to try my luck and put some fuel in the tank and then try starting it. Now there's not a purge bulb on this blower, so I'm going to cheat and manually prime it instead. That basically keeps me from pulling it until my arm falls off. I hate to say it, but I really like the way older equipment sounds. I'm not sure why, I just do. So it looks like it runs okay. It's a bit lean on fuel, but as the engine gets warmer, it's not as lean, so it runs a lot better. I might look into tuning it later on, but for right now, I'm going to keep it the way it is. Another option as to why this engine wouldn't start is it could have a faulty spark plug. Unfortunately, the inline spark checker wouldn't be able to tell you that, and you would need to use a tester that could test them outside of the engine. Overall, even though it's big, heavy, and kind of strange looking, I really like this blower, and if I can't get rid of it, I don't have a problem keeping it to use here and there, but only for a few minutes at a time, of course. So my question is, if you saw this for sale on the marketplace and it was very affordable, would you buy it? Personally, I wouldn't bother, but if it was free, I might consider it. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.